Part two. Um, we need to deal. So we barely avoided the war. Well, we barely avoided conflict in the Missouri Compromise in 1821. We barely avoided political war, at least, in the Compromise of 1850. Through the 50s, things are going to get progressively worse. And we need to look at two more events. The first is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which amazingly enough has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with slavery, political slave states. Up until now, everything has been about political power. It hasn't been about, we should abolish slavery, slavery's bad. No one's cared. What it's been about is the future directing the vision of the country, right? We talked about this. You've written a paper about this. The vision of the country and what the new state should follow. What should the new states be, free states or slave states? This is different. This is a very simple proposal put forth by Stephen Douglas to organize the Nebraska Territory, this huge area of Nebraska Territory, into a Kansas Territory and a Nebraska Territory. Again, look on page 407. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. The important part about this is the reason he does this is so that they can build a transcontinental railroad. If you have an organized territory, being the Kansas Territory, we can build a transcontinental railroad through it to get to California. That's what he was trying to do. Some because he was tied in with the railroad guys, some because he thought it was great for the country. And it would have been. And it will be when it's done. But here's the problem. When he draws this line, he proposes that Kansas be set up as an area of popular sovereignty, meaning Kansas, once they got organized, could vote on whether they wanted to be a free or slave state. Look at your map. Why is that a problem? Exactly. Kansas is above the Missouri Compromise line. In fact, the bottom line of Kansas is the Missouri Compromise line, or, well, approximately. So that sacred pledge that had been set would be broken if Kansas could become a slave state. Well, needless to say, Northerners were outraged at this. In fact, the reason Stephen Douglas did it was to get the Southerners behind it, and he got enough Southerners behind it, plus enough people wanted the railroad that it passed. People are going to be angry. They're going to be extremely angry about this. An entire new political party will form. You may have heard of them. They are called the Republicans. Yes, the same Republicans we have today. No, they did not fight for the same things back then, but it's a continuous party. What's going to happen is that you are going to get Southerners flocking out there. You're going to get Northerners flocking out there. Both of them. The only people who go out there are the extremists on both sides, the ardent ones who really want this to be a slave state, really want this to be a free state, and they have people paying them to go out there to set up and vote. This is where John Brown comes in. You're going to hear about this. I want to jump for a second, though, to our fourth event. Because our fourth event, well, it doesn't happen in Congress. All three events up till now, all compromises, if you will, up till now, have been in Congress. This is the Supreme Court. I call this the compromise buster. All right. It's called the Dred Scott decision. Now, it talks plenty about Dred Scott in his book. So you know the basic story. Dred Scott versus Sanford, a court case in 1857. Scott was a slave. He belonged to an army surgeon who lived up in Wisconsin. He came from Missouri with his slave. He took Dred Scott a slave to Wisconsin, and then he died, and Dred Scott was sent back to be inherited. Right? Well, Dred Scott sues. Dred Scott sues, saying, I was living in a free state. Residents in free state should guarantee me freedom. And so I can't be shipped back to be inherited. It's appealed, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is where it all happens. This is where we get the FUBAR issue, essentially. Okay? Roger Taney is the Supreme Court Justice. He throws out the case, which means he refuses to hear the case, which means the court decision below is upheld, which would make Scott not, or would keep Scott in slavery. The problem is not that. That's fine. The problem is his justification, because when you decide on decision or when you throw out a decision, somebody, usually the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice, will actually write out his decision, the justification. This is what he says. Roger Taney says Scott is not a, he says three things. One, he says Scott is not a citizen of the U.S. Slaves have never been, according to the Constitution. Okay, that's going to anger a lot of people right there. From the very beginning, it's like, okay, you are not a citizen because you are a slave. Already problematic. But the next two get more. Second, he says residence in a free state does not mean freedom. That means that any slave who escaped and is living in a free state and has been for decades, maybe the sons of slaves who escaped up there 50, 60, 70 years ago, are technically still slaves. Okay. Again, are you seeing some of the problems can come out of this? Finally, and this is the killer. This is the huge one. It says, the Supreme Court can't prohibit slavery in a state or territory. Roger Taney could have just said the first two. Scott is not a citizen of the U.S. Residence in a free state does not mean freedom. Those are problematic enough. But he says, I'm going to repeat it. The Supreme Court can't prohibit slavery in a state or a territory. What's the Supreme Court's job? To check the constitutionality of laws. Which means, if the Supreme Court can't do it, the federal government can't do it. If the federal government cannot prohibit slavery in a state or territory, that's a state issue alone, then this changes everything. It repeals the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because that was the federal government dictating that there could be popular sovereignty. It killed the idea of popular sovereignty could even occur, because that is not up to the federal government. That is not an issue the federal government can deal with. They can't set up territories like that. Finally, and this is the killer. This is the one that boggles the mind. Because the federal government cannot dictate it, and the federal government has dictated free or slave or the ability to do that in all of these territories to the east or to the west, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. The Missouri Compromise divided the North and South. It can be free up here, it can be slave down here. That was a federal government decision. Roger Taney, in one fell swoop, said that doesn't work. In fact, he did away with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, all these things that kept peace for the last, 30, 40 years. He wipes out in one fell swoop. 1857. You're starting over from the drawing board. There's no peace. The issues are all flooding back. And this is the thing where things are going to turn a little up. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week.